Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. After a couple of guest spots in a row, we are back, just Megan and I, to yap at you. I am Clayton Becker.
And I am Megan Cox.
And Megan, what are we going to talk about today?
Today, we are going to be talking about a topic near and dear to your heart, Clayton. We are going to be talking about rejecting the school pickup line and embracing the school bus. So this gives you the chance to talk about, urbanism, transportation, all your favorite things.
Literally all my favorite things. And I'll note up at the top here that this episode is not solely going to be about school buses. This is going to be about sort of like urbanism and education more generally. But I think it's sort of a useful frame to discuss how we are like literally baking in suburban design choices into like every aspect of our built environment.
And this is really one very clear manifestation, the school bus versus the pickup line. It's one clear manifestation of all the things that we're kind of doing poorly or we're not really thinking all the way through.
Yeah, and that have sort of these not like proximate negative consequences, but like down the line negative consequences that then you don't necessarily associate as being part of the design choice that you made 10, 15 years ago. But before we get into all of this, Megan, how did you get to school as a youth many, many moons ago?
As a youth back in the day. So I was driven to school for the first couple of years, like elementary, kindergarten, first, second grade, in the sense that I was driven to a before school care. And then to get to school, I took a school bus from that before school care facility and took it back to the after school care facility. Then sixth grade through third grade, second grade, third grade through middle school, I took the bus every day. And by the time I got to high school, I went to a private high school that did not have buses, and I went back to getting a ride, carpooling, etc. Though I will say my private high school had school buses that drove to the further out parishes in their kind of catchment area. So not really the traditional school bus route, but it was on the city bus route. And it was also very close to a transit center. So it was actually very transit accessible for kids.
I had a vaguely similar experience, at least for the first, like, for those who aren't aware, like, I moved to California young, but like Megan and I were both like raised, at least for the first part of our lives, in the same part of Northern Oregon, the Portland area. And so when I was in Portland, I took the school bus to school every day. I was, as I recall, like towards the end of the route both ways somehow. And so I felt like I spent a lot of time on that school bus. But then when I moved to California, there were no school buses in the town that my family moved to. So when I was in elementary school, I was mostly driven to school. And then starting in middle school, I either biked or walked, or by the time that I was, of driving age to get to high school, I would often drive myself to high school. Mostly just because it was like a 30-minute walk either way. And I didn't want to ride my bike anymore after I got hit freshman year by a car. And I was like,
that'd do it.
Yeah, that'll do it, right? That'll do it for you. And also, I will say, like, my high school had just an enormous parking lot as part of it. Like, it was, maybe a quarter of the land area of the school itself was just like a parking lot. And then there was another parking lot, like, at the park north of my high school that like would be full of cars from students during the school day. It was like an overflow lot that wasn't supposed to be an overflow lot, but got used as one because so many students were driving to school and there wasn't enough space in the parking lot for all of them.
I guess that makes sense if there are no buses. You have to put those cars someplace.
Yeah.
But just the idea of making the decision to not have buses, I'm so curious as to how we get there. I'm sure you will be getting us into that in short order.
Yes. I mean, there are a number of different reasons for different communities, but they all sort of go back to school districts find it costly to have bus service. And so if there's not a compelling thing that gets them to have it, then they often won't. But I think that to bridge out of these childhood anecdotes of ours, the point of the episode here is that the way that students travel to school has really changed over the last half century or so. the like methods of getting to school that Megan and I just described, where like your parents drive you to school or you drive yourself to school, those are really new, right? They are and much more common today than they used to be. Today being 2024, the last time we have like concrete data on this, we don't have this like month by month data. But today, for the first time in American history, as far as we know, right, is the first time that the majority of students arrive to school in a private vehicle rather than on foot or on a bike or in a school bus. 2024 specifically is when we flipped over from majority other methods of transportation to it being majority, just straight up majority in private vehicles. And depending on the city, according to the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, an estimated 10 to 15% of all rush hour traffic is just parents driving their children to school in the morning. Like more than 1 out of every 10 cars that you see on the road, if your commute is mostly, in surface streets rather than sort of on the freeway, right? That is someone driving their kid to school in the morning. It is an enormous portion of what constitutes morning traffic. And this really contrasts to how things used to be, how kids used to get to school. So let's actually answer Megan's question here of like, how did this happen? What was the decision not to have school buses? So the proportion of children taking the school bus has fallen precipitously over the last 50 years or so. This really started sort of in the 70s and 80s, both with inflation and sort of the Reaganomics era, where you had a lot of like cuts to government funding, but also notably here, I think we should say, because of a backlash to the busing that was basically okayed, right, by the Supreme Court as a method of desegregating schools. Lots of parents were quite upset about this. And so when there were funding cuts that needed, quote unquote, to go around, being the operative word here, many parents did not fight particularly hard for school buses, right?
So let me understand this and maybe break it down a little bit more. So busing, the practice of integrating school districts or particular schools by transporting students further than they previously had been and kind of mixing up catchment areas and bringing people into different schools than they had previously been brought to. Using the school buses gave parents kind of a lingering dissatisfaction with the mode of transportation, busing, not just the integration practice of busing. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Yes.
Gotcha.
I guess to go even a little bit further here, because I forget sometimes that people don't just have this in their brains, right? Like the process of school desegregation was furthered by this practice called busing, because even though like students were now legally allowed to attend these schools, like Black students were legally allowed to attend previously all white schools, there was still this pervasive residential segregation, right? And so in order to actually integrate the schools, rather than just say, oh, well, we did away with the legal regime that meant that they couldn't go here, you had to bring students in from other parts of a city or other parts of a county in order to actually integrate the school. And so, yes, the lingering dissatisfaction with that practice, which many parents were very, very unhappy with, right, was then connected specifically to the form of transportation, not just the practice of people moving around using the school bus as the method of transportation. And then also, this backlash probably made white flight worse. So for those who aren't aware, again, sorry, forgetting people don't always have this in their brain. White flight basically refers to the exodus of white people from like core urban cities, places like Los Angeles, Boston, Chicago, Dallas, Houston, Miami, whatever, what have you, right? New York, out into suburban communities, suburban sprawl outside of the core urban area. And since school districts are often, specifically delineated by like town boundaries, right? And you have to get like intra-district transfer approvals and all of that in order to go to a high school in a different city or in a different catchment area. This was a way for white families to ensure that even with busing, in many instances, their children still would not be going to school with non-white people, which is not amazing.
No, it's not great, but now we're still living, even if we have moved past that as parents, older parents aged out to being grandparents, and newer parents don't have that concern necessarily. We are kind of left with school districts that are atomized, and growth in housing and growth in student populations is further out in the suburbs that were created by that white flight.
Yeah, and on top of that, like it is just more difficult to run school buses in a suburban environment than it is in an urban one, just because everything is way more spread out, right?
I mean, you say that, but you could not pay me enough money to drive something as big as a school bus in an urban area.
True. But in terms of just like, if we think about the population density of a normal transit line, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's less efficient, shall we say, to have school buses in a large urban area with a bunch of different subdivisions, and there's only like 2 access roads and a bunch of cul-de-sacs and, so on and so forth, right?
Totally.
So like the urban form is what sort of helps make school buses work and be efficient. Like we talked about this sort of way back in our episode on multimodal transportation, that like this is a bit of a geometry problem. Like buses move people more efficiently than cars. But if you can't actually get to where the people are using the bus, then it becomes a little bit trickier. And so
absolutely.
You have this long, precipitous decline in school bus usage. But then following this sort of long, slow decline over many, many years, COVID just absolutely supercharges it. This is what has really taken the majority, being other modes of transportation, to being private vehicles, is specifically this very sharp drop off during the pandemic. It led to a bunch of cutbacks all over the country in multiple different school districts, bus driver shortages, and then because parents are worried about their kids catching COVID on the bus, choosing to drive their children to school even if school buses are available. So we had this long, slow decline. The quote about like falling asleep slowly and then all at once, right? That's sort of what happened here.
Would we also say that maybe work from home facilitated this as well? All of a sudden,
absolutely.
You have parents don't need to rely on their children getting on and off the bus. They have the time in their day to take a half an hour break at 2:00 and go run to pick their kids up.
Yeah, or since most school days start before the workday starts, it's even easier, right? If they're not like worrying about getting to work on time, right? Their specific office, they can take an additional half hour at 8 a.m, to drop their child off before the workday begins, right? They can get back home and they can handle all sorts of things before it becomes time to start work at sort of, 8:45, 9 o'clock, whatever, right? But it's not just school buses that have declined. And this is where we're going to move past school buses and into sort of broader general urbanism here. Walking has declined way more even than school buses have, because it has never been the case that the majority of students got to school in a school bus. It was the case for quite a long time that almost everyone walked to school because you lived very close to your school. And even by the time that we reach sort of like the mid-70s, where we're sort of at this height of like the suburban sprawl, right, of the 70s and 80s, even in those days, more than 40% of children walked to school. But over the last 55 years, since 1970, the proportion of students who walk to school has declined from 40.7% to just 11%. And sorry, go ahead, Megan.
No, I'm just thinking about this because that's, to what extent did you find in your research that this is also kind of linked to a decline in social trust? Because that timing just jumped out at me.
No one that I am aware of has specifically looked at this being about declines in social trust. The decline has been sort of like pretty precipitous. It's been like fairly linear. It wasn't like, oh my God, Watergate, now we have
nobody can walk. But that's like the 70s are serial killer time, and you start to get satanic panic and people freaking out about kids getting snatched by strangers.
I wouldn't be surprised if that's part of it, but I don't think no one that I came across at least has explicitly linked the two.
Okay, sort of, I think that would, if somebody's looking for an additional avenue of research on this subject, I think that would be a very interesting point to make, and probably more broadly about busing and as well, that parents who like to have more awareness of where their kids are. Okay, the kid leaves my house in my car and I deliver them to the schoolhouse door and I retrieve them from the same spot 6 hours later. A parent may feel a little bit safer in an environment where they don't feel like they trust their neighbors.
Yeah, where the child doesn't leave protective custody, as it were.
Yes.
Right?
Just like our trunk or treat episode. Cast your mind back.
Cast your mind back. I mean, honestly, nobody listened to that episode because it was the Halloween special, but like, well, a few
It was
people.
some of our best work.
I mean, it was the most freewheeling we've ever been. But go back and listen to that one if you're interested in it. But so in terms of what we have pointed to in sort of causing this decline, the research largely points to this being sort of about the built environment and like school consolidation. So people just live farther from school than they used to because we've sort of centralized schools in like your suburban town has one high school, right? As opposed to a few that are in different parts of the city, right? And then also like, we've made lots of suburban cityscapes kind of like actively hostile for children who are trying to walk to school, like having to cross 6-lane roads, or 4-lane roads without parental supervision. If you live far away from a school, this is just something that's kind of a non-starter.
I also think it's interesting that you see more fencing around school properties these days, which like my elementary school had one like rope chain fence that just delineated what the property was. But I knew kids who could walk across. Again, this is showing how rural the area right around where I went to school was. People could walk across pastures to get to school versus going around, adding 20 minutes onto their walk or something like that.
It was interesting. The campus of my elementary school and my middle school were both like closed campuses with like fencing like around the entire property, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Both of them were actually on the same big street in town, my middle school and elementary school. And so I guess it makes a little bit of sense, right? Like you're trying to keep kids who are on that property from like, hurting
Wandering
themselves,
off.
right?
Yes.
The high school wasn't and isn't as closed a campus. Like you can get around the campus, but there is fencing, lots of fencing, like sort of all around it. It's also on another one of the sort of big arterials in town. There are parts of it you can access, but you can't access all of it, sort of at all hours of the day. You like the way that you can with, say, a more open university campus like UCLA, right? Where you can just go basically anywhere. You might not be able to enter some of the buildings, but there's not like fences around the entire school. But yeah, this has become more common as well recently, I think. And part of it has to do with the next bit, which is that walking to school has, in lots of communities, become just sort of an actively dangerous proposition for many students and their families. There's a 2016 study that I came across while I was doing the research for this episode from researchers at York University in Canada. They look at both Canadian schools and American schools, and they identified dangerous driving behavior at 88% of schools in their sample. This isn't like constant dangerous driving behavior. Like it's not like
occasional.
It's not like every single day some guy like runs through 5 stop signs in a Dodge Charger, right? But it is like from time to time, right? That there's some sort of dangerous driving behavior around these schools, which is quite frankly enough for parents not to want their kids to walk to school.
Yes.
But the problem here, so we understand sort of like there's like decent reasons, perhaps, at least for the walking piece, like from an individual perspective, an individual's family's perspective, why you might not want to have your children walk to school or take a school bus with COVID and fears of catching COVID on that, convenience for families, what have you, right? The problem, however, is that this has gotten so bad and has become such a expectation among families that we're purpose building schools with areas for a school pickup line as opposed to like bus drop off and pickup.
Which is, I mean, it strikes me as such a completely wild sea change to have happened so quickly. And also, as I look at this and I hear what you're saying and I think about it, I think there is going to be, if we continue down this road, a pretty obvious disparate impact on the basis of gender happening here, because the expectation, I think, in most heterosexual couples is going to be that the mom is the one who is then responsible for transporting children to and from school.
Yeah.
And that's going to have the effect of changing her availability to participate in the workforce. Either she's going to need a part-time job, or to be out of work, or to be more selective in the work that she takes, and something that ensures that she can be work from home or hybrid, and that's going to limit professional opportunities.
Yeah, or some job that
women
will
with children.
especially if we don't see the kind of funding that we need to like bring back comprehensive after school programs, right? Which
I
have
would
also
think.
faced some pretty steep cuts during the pandemic. And
Because
as
you
far
don't
as,
need them because
yeah.
parents are home and available.
And it's sort of like how even with lots of things having normalized since the pandemic, it's the case that like behavior is sticky, right? And so shocks to behavior about people not being in these after school programs, not like funding them properly, not having the requisite number of educators who are a part of them, that drop off increases more slowly. Right? We've seen the same thing with sort of like public transit ridership, right? So many different examples of this phenomenon that we can point to. And the thing is that we are baking these patterns of the school pickup line, and we're baking these patterns of anti-urban design into like the fundamental built environment and like the building codes of how we go about building schools. Making it
Hostile design is what this is called in relation to people in the public, particularly unhoused people in the public. And I think we might term it that. This design is hostile to people who want to live in a way other than driving their children to and from school.
Yeah. And I think that like this is the crux of the episode that I really want to get to here, which is that we are making it basically impossible. We are making it basically impossible to build schools in a way that where buses would be quick and efficient and where kids feel comfortable walking to school. We're just making it totally impossible. Let me give you an example, a concrete real world example of how we're baking this into our cities at a physical level. So Charlotte, North Carolina is sort of one of the prototypical like Sun Belt cities, growing very quickly, lots of new job opportunities, huge increase in the population of the metro area over the last 20 years or so. It's having trouble finding space for all of its students as it grows, as new families move there, as new people need to get educated. In particular, the downtown area of Charlotte, North Carolina, which annoyingly they call Uptown in Charlotte, which I'm going to try to get right for the rest of the episode, but don't hate me if you're from Charlotte and I mess it up, has only one very small high school that is supposed to specifically serve students with disabilities, both physical and intellectual disabilities. The next closest high school is a 10-minute drive or a 50-minute walk away.
50,
and it's
15 or 50?
50-minute walk, 10-minute drive. Yeah. From like the center of the Uptown area. There we go. Got it right. So that's the next closest one. And that's a magnet school specifically for health sciences. The closest like real, by which I mean sort of just like
comprehensive.
Like just general public high school with no special purposes or specific enrollment procedures or anything like that, is 5 miles outside of downtown. Which means that basically every family that lives in the Uptown area or in its vicinity has basically no choice but to drive their kids to school every morning or send them to not a private school. Because there are charter schools and
to a private school, yes. A non-public school.
Yes, there are charter schools and private schools in this area, but no sort of general purpose public schools. It also disincentivizes families from living in that area because you don't necessarily want to do that. You don't want to have to take your children to school every morning. And I should note here that the elementary and middle school situation in the Uptown area of Charlotte is not much better. So, with that in mind, why have they not built a new school in that area when they have clear demand and a clear problem where students in that area do not have a high school or really an elementary school or a middle school that is close enough for them to walk or bike to? Well, it's because they're not allowed to. They're not legally allowed to build a high school in this area, despite the fact that fully 1/4 of the Uptown area is off-street surface parking. Plenty of room for one. They are not allowed to build this school because North Carolina planners have it in their guidelines that you have to have more space than is available in downtown. Under their prescribed rules, high schools in North Carolina require a minimum of 30 acres plus 1 additional acre for every 100 projected enrolled students. So a high school with, say, 1,500 students, you would need, at baseline, without having to get any sort of exemptions to these guidelines, a 45-acre space on which to build your school.
So I have two questions about this. This is in administrative rule or code, or where is this rule coming from?
This is in federal educational guidelines that North Carolina has adopted.
Okay. Question 2, I guess. So we're saying like a 30-acre plot horizontally?
It just has to be like a 30-acre area. You can like combine different lots, like you can figure things out, but there's no vertical.
You can't go vertically on this.
I'll note here that before we get into some other stuff, you can request an exemption to these guidelines if you cannot demonstrate that there is space to put this, like if you can demonstrate that there isn't space to put a school, like under the current guidelines. But the thing is that there is space to put these high schools in just different parts of Charlotte.
Different parts of, okay, I guess the last question I have is, why do you need that much space? Is there some sort of explanation for this?
The reason that is given is a similar reason for sort of the undercurrent that like undergirds all of suburban development, which is that people having more space is better. And the idea being that you have to have a certain amount of space for your students, which is why they...
Final question, have these folks been to an IKEA? Because that's just not true.
But this is like a fundamental principle. This like undergirds lots of suburban development, undergirds lots of sprawl. We don't want to be living on top of each other. Like, I don't know if you've sort of ever been to a high school in suburban Los Angeles. Like, basically,
I went to the public high school that I would have gone to if I'd stayed in public school. Is a pretty prototypical suburban high school, I think.
Like my high school, all one story, like no multi-story buildings, right?
Isn't that just to avoid any possible like ADA issues and you don't want students monkeying around with elevators?
I don't think
Isn't that what we're doing?
I really don't think so, because you have multi-story public schools all over the place in cities that don't have this kind of space. So let me get into how this is like not unique to North Carolina.
Okay. This all strikes me as very dumb. I just want to jump in there.
Is very dumb. That's the point we're trying to make.
I am struggling with this intentionally on your part.
Like, so this isn't just true of Charlotte. This isn't just true of North Carolina. This is true of many American states and cities. You simply cannot build new public schools in like truly urban environments in large portions of many parts of American cities. Charlotte, I just said, or North Carolina, because it's not Charlotte specifically, requires 30 acres for a high school. It requires 10 acres for a elementary school at baseline and 20 acres for a middle school. And lots of this is also like they sort of have this idea that you need to have sports facilities, right? And those take up a lot of space. And sort of as you go higher, you need more sports facilities, right? A large portion of my high school's campus was like the football field and like the baseball stadium and basketball and all of that. Oklahoma is the same as North Carolina in this respect, in terms of how much space they require for their new schools. Delaware, Alabama, and Missouri, as well as a couple of others, have exactly the same requirements. Ohio and Pennsylvania actually require slightly more space for their public high schools. High schools have to be 35 acres at baseline, plus 1 acre for every 100 students. And then California, Hawaii, Arizona, and Minnesota require even more space than that. We are like quite literally just making it impossible to build schools in a way that supports people arriving at school in any other way than in private vehicles. And when we say 40% of students arrive on foot, or 10% arrive on foot, that's like 100% of students in like New York City, right? Or like 85% of students in New York City are arriving that way. And then like 2% are arriving that way in, like Round Rock, Texas or something like that, right? It's not that like at any given school you have 11%, 30%, 50%, whatever, right? It's at some schools, lots of people get there on foot or on a bike or in a bus. And then at other schools, almost no one does.
Something else I want to throw in there is school districts are actually reaching out to parents to tell them they can't let their kids walk in certain situations. Like there are walking zones and parents aren't allowed to make that call for themselves, which I'm sure diminishes one's willingness to walk. If the school district is telling you, no, that's not, we have decided for you that that's not safe for your kid.
Yes, we have decided that the dangerous behavior of drivers near our school that constitutes the need for us to put up a fence so that students don't wander into the street chasing a ball. we have decided that means, and we built the school here. We knew that this was going to happen, right? We knew we were building it along a busy arterial road. We've decided that means you are not allowed to let your students walk to school. Yeah, this absolutely happens. And to go back to sort of what I was saying a little earlier, you can request exemptions to these guidelines, and often you do get exemptions to these guidelines if you can demonstrate that it is not physically possible to build a school in your community at a lot that meets those descriptions. But the problem is with lots of these growing metro areas where you sort of have tons of greenfield development, you absolutely cannot demonstrate that there is not a suitable site for you to put your school. And so rather than locating a high school next to stuff that's already been built out in the town, you build a high school outside of the city. And so everyone who wants to get there is either forced to walk a long distance or bike a long distance, or their parents drive them to school every day, at least until they have their license. And you'll see this in almost every sort of growing metro area in the country, or even not like huge growing metro areas. I know like last year, maybe a year and a half ago, actually, at this point, when I went back to my dad's hometown in Iowa for my grandmother's funeral, we all stayed in like the next town over because that's where there's like a hotel and stuff. And the high school that they're building for that town is this huge thing half a mile outside the city for a town of like what is now 6,000 people. But they project that it is going to grow. And so they are building this huge thing well outside of the town area. And the high school itself is basically as big as the college that is there in Orange City. It's this enormous thing. It's huge. And you're like, why could you possibly need all of that space? And the reason is because you are required to have all of that space as a baseline, and you have to get specific exemptions in order to not do that. And so many planners are just not going to go to the trouble of getting those exemptions.
All of that makes sense in the sense that it holds together logically. I understand how the incentives are bad. The incentives themselves, we have gotten ourselves into a place where the thing that we are doing doesn't make sense for our goals, I think. So I have a feeling you're going to tell us how we can unravel all of this and make it better.
Well, hopefully. I'm going to tell you what we should do.
Okay. Do we want to take a break before we get to the fixes?
We can take a break, yeah. The basic point of the first half of the podcast here is that these rules they shouldn't really exist in the first place. As Megan said, they're kind of dumb. So when we come back, I'll tell you what we should do. I'll be perfectly honest. Today, I am feeling pessimistic, and I don't think we're actually going to do any of these things. But I'll tell you what we can do to help unravel some of these bad choices. We'll be back in a second.
That sounds great.
We'll be back in a second.
Welcome back, everyone, to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. When we left you, Clayton was telling us all about the pretty dumb rules that are making it basically impossible to do anything but drive your kid to school. So Clayton, I'm sure, has some ways that we can fix this. What do you got for us?
I do have a few ways that we can fix this. And honestly, a lot of them come down to, like, let's stop doing dumb things.
Really the thesis of this entire show.
The thesis of the entire show, but I think maybe more specifically in this case, like there are some things that we've talked about where like we actually sort of require like big policy solutions, and like there's been these sort of long-term entrenched things that we need to fix. It requires, going back to tradition, but in a way that means adopting new policies that make sort of the way that things used to be done more plausible, right? That's not really the case here. Like the fundamental things that we should do here are to stop making terrible choices. So the first thing that I have for you is we really need to relax the rules on just how big school campuses need to be. Or at the very least, we should make it much, much easier to get these exemptions from like sort of baseline rules about how big these schools need to be. Like the thing is that this clearly works in places where it is allowed. Like, for instance, the state of New York has rules that are similar to the requirements that we went over for other states. But those rules do not apply specifically in New York City.
Which makes perfect sense.
Because obviously they don't apply in New York City, right? Like, for obvious reasons, they do not apply in New York City. It would make it impossible to build literally a single school if you had to like get an exemption every single time, right? Also, we sort of mentioned during the Charlotte example that while public schools are beholden to these rules, and in certain states, charter schools are also beholden to these private schools are not at all. And in some states, charter schools aren't either. And, we've got a whole episode with our good friend Alexander on sort of the problems of charter schools, like at writ large, at like a societal level, the problems that they cause sort of socially. But the problems with charter schools are not really that like they are fundamentally failing to educate the students that attend them. They do a fine job, it seems, of educating the students that attend them. It's just that the students that attend them end up siphoning resources away from other forms of education, so on and so forth.
But because we have charter schools and private schools that are not necessarily meeting these requirements that are placed on public schools, we can see that public schools don't actually need to be as big as we're saying they are to be successful in educating students, right? That's where we're headed.
Yes,
with this, right?
exactly. Right? Like,
okay.
And like insofar as these schools do face some challenges with like sort of they can self-select their students, maybe they wouldn't be successful if they had to educate everyone. You can go listen to the charter schools episode.
Mm-hmm.
The fundamental problem they're facing is that they're not struggling, or they wouldn't struggle because they're too tiny. Like that's just not a thing that's happening. Yeah, as Megan said, like the fact that like these schools successfully educate students without being beholden to these requirements maybe should suggest to us that the requirements are like not super necessary in the first place. And also, like the fact that public schools are beholden to these requirements in a lot of cases means that families are further pushed towards private school education and charter school education. It's more convenient to send your kid to the charter school that doesn't have to abide by the 30-acre requirement, then you're much more likely to send them to that charter school, right? And that's a bad thing for public education generally. And so we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't want that. And then also, existing public schools, those that were built prior to the adoption of these requirements in many states, those that were built out in the 50s and the 60s and the early 70s before states started adopting these requirements, they do just fine without all of this space, right? Like I talked about my high school earlier, and according to the state of California, my high school, with roughly 2,100 students, with not exactly growing student population, but also not shrinking student population. According to the state of California, my high school should have been 56 acres at baseline, just according to their guidelines. It was roughly 20 acres. It was less than half the size that the state of California thinks it should have been.
I'm still baffled, one, by that size. And two, is anyone giving a good explanation why high schools can't share football facilities, etc.? Like, why does every high school in the district need its own football field?
Podcasting is not a noted visual medium, but for those who are watching, I'm shaking my head.
Yep, we are both baffled.
Yeah, I'm sure that at one point there were like well written up justifications, 30 years ago when these rules were being sort of written, and the idea being that like, oh well, you need all this like natural space or whatever. The sort of like esoteric movements of the time about like, oh, it's really great to like commune with nature and you need to have room for a botanical garden on your campus and also a football field. And I'm sure these were written. I did not come across them in my research, and the rationale seems weak at best. You simply do not need this much space. You really don't. You don't need this much space for a new high school. You don't.
Yeah.
You don't need it.
Anecdotally, for whatever it's worth, the facilities that are abandoned when you build a new high school are often turned into middle schools.
Turned into middle schools, yeah.
The facilities themselves are not failing to provide a sufficient educational space or environment, etc. So, yeah, okay. Let's get rid of these rules that make it basically impossible to build a high school in an area where a high school is needed and push people further out into the suburbs or push people into driving their children to school.
Yeah. Like, big fundamental thing. Like, let's stop making it really, really hard for us to build high schools in a way that makes more sense.
Okay.
Like, yeah, it's
The
it's
rules don't seem to be justified.
The rules do not seem to be justified. Like, it's a bit like when we did our episode on deportation and immigration and birthright citizenship. Like, it's so dumb that we have to have this conversation, right? Like, in the same way that birthright citizenship is like so obviously in the Constitution that like Megan and I both at separate points of that episode went a little bit crazy over like how dumb it is that people are arguing that it isn't. Like, this is how I feel at this moment. Like, it is so dumb that we have these baseline requirements for schools. But anyway, enough about that. Enough about like the very obvious thing that we should do. The second thing that we should do here is we really need to allow for denser forms of housing near existing transit and existing high schools. This shouldn't really be that complicated to understand, but like maybe I'll spell out just a little bit. So, like, students are able to walk to school, they're able to bike to school, they're able to take transit to school when those options are available to them. They're able to take the bus to school when that option is available to them, when they are concentrated in a small enough geographic area that makes sense for a city to run buses. Because it doesn't make sense for a city to run 9 different bus networks all out to like each subdivision, you know, in a like Sunbelt town, a Sunbelt exurb. That like really doesn't make very efficient sense. But it does make sense in an area where you only have to run sort of like 1 or 2 or 3 bus routes in your catchment area. And the bus stops are only, you know, a quarter mile away, an eighth of a mile away from where most students live. Lots of people are concerned, I think, about students living in denser forms of housing. They're concerned about people living in apartments, so on and so forth. Concerns about apartments and density breeding crime, right? These concerns really are unfounded.
Where does this come from? Is it just racism or fear of immigrants, or what is the story here?
I think it is mostly racism.
Okay, cool.
I think it's like,
as is always the case.
Yeah. Like there do appear to be, this is maybe an insight for podcast listeners into like my broader research agenda. There do appear to be many people who are like just sort of affectively turned off by apartments. They like just don't like apartments aesthetically. I'm trying to avoid calling people racist because I don't like it. But there are a lot of people who are at the very least racially motivated and do not like apartments because they do not like the people that they perceive live in apartments. Yeah.
Maybe socioeconomically motivated.
Yes, as well.
You know,
people really think that apartments depress property values. They absolutely think that this is the case.
Yeah.
We
all know that that's true for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, there's not a lot of great economic evidence that they actually decrease property values, but like people really think that they do. Yeah.
They absolutely. That is for sure true.
Yeah.
Okay. So people don't want apartments built near schools because they're afraid that will bring people into their communities that they don't want.
Yes, people think this. They don't want apartments getting built. But the fact of the matter here is that one of the key reasons why so many people used to walk to school, why we had 40% of students getting to school on foot or you know, on more if you include biking, just as like close to us as 50 years ago, is because they lived close enough to do that. And you can't really have that unless you allow more housing near these school sites. And in particular, if you like don't allow schools to be built in existing communities, if you require them to be built outside of town, then you're even further removing people's ability to walk or bike or take the bus to school.
And it strikes me that it's desirable. This might be jumping ahead for us, but there are people who very much want to live, maybe not necessarily in apartments, maybe in houses that are closer together, maybe in duplexes, and they want the option of living close to their school. When a development was put in across the street from my elementary school, that was one of the big draws. No one had ever walked to my school before, except for the kids who were hiking across a pasture. But all of a sudden, there's a major development going in across the street. And now we've got, what do we even call them? Lollipop ladies are the term in the UK, but people with the
crossing guards.
Crossing guards. Thank you. Like, what the hell did we call these things? The people who, crossing guards. Thank you. Oh, that was great. Such is the life of a multicultural kid, I guess. But all of a sudden we had to put in the infrastructure for that. But people really wanted to live in those houses because they were so close to the school. People actually do. And you can see that reflected in the property values in my neighborhood now. People want to be able to have their little craftsman bungalow and walk their kid to the elementary school that's 2 blocks away. That's desirable.
Yeah, the reason why dense mixed use walkable neighborhoods are so expensive is because people want them and there aren't enough of them. Maybe you don't.
Supply and demand. How do they work?
Maybe some, like, I don't know how many of our listeners aren't like people who will receive this message well, right? Like probably most of our listeners are sort of in agreement with us on this, but like maybe you as a person don't want this, right? Like you don't want to live in a mixed use area with like shops and businesses and all that and everything. But it's very clear that like there are people out there who have preferences that are different from yours, and they do want to live in that kind of neighborhood, right? And right now, and I'm sure we'll do a full episode on this in the coming months, coming weeks, about like just rejecting sprawl and embracing the urban form or something. We're just making it totally impossible to build that in the same way that we are making it impossible to build more urban schools. We are making it totally impossible in a much more real sense to build like actual urban centers in like huge parts of our most in-demand metro areas. So that's the second thing. Like we need to allow people to live close to schools because people will live close to schools in the end if we sort of allow that housing to get built. It is desirable. Third, we need to improve school transport again. We need to sort of get out from what we did, the cutbacks and the shortages that we faced during COVID. We have to fund buses again, both like school buses and regular buses, since lots of students in many cities around the country do take like just full-on public transport to school.
Regular bus.
Yeah, especially places that where, have good public transit networks, places like New York or DC, or even in LA. I often see people who are quite obviously high school students taking my bus while I'm on the way to UCLA.
In urban Portland, the kids are taking TriMet. There is not a yellow school bus. They are taking the regular public bus network. Yeah.
And might I say, TriMet's fun to take. It's like enjoyable. I don't know. Like every time I come back to Portland, I enjoy it. I really enjoy just stepping out of the train at the zoo station and just getting the wind, that hits you.
Yeah. The light rail is great in Portland. I'm a big fan of the light rail.
My mom, when I was a kid, used to take me and my sister into downtown Portland on the bus. And I asked her sort of like a couple of years ago, like why she did this, like why did she take us on the bus? Apart from the reason like that we only had one car at the time, but like the primary reason why she said she did this because she didn't want us to grow up to be maladjusted weirdos who were scared of taking public transportation. And I gotta say, it worked. It worked really well.
It worked. Well, and that's something else I've been thinking about. When we take away buses as like for elementary school kids, we are taking away their opportunity to learn how to ride a bus. And so they continue to not use transit as adults, right? That's going to have a long-term effect, I think, on people's preferences as they age into being part of the voting population.
Yeah.
So that's something to be concerned about. And another good reason why we need to put buses back into the school system, into the school day. Additionally, bringing buses back into schools, that's going to have an effect on the social development of children to a certain extent.
Yeah, it's like a large amount of relatively unsupervised, basically unstructured time where kids are going to like talk and socialize and do things that they might not necessarily do under like the watchful eye of teachers or like recess monitors outside when they're playing at recess,
you do still have that supervision of the driver. And it's so funny because I was thinking about this. I can remember the names of my bus drivers from when I was in elementary school. And it's just, you are not completely unsupervised. So there is, I'm sure, a reason why it's so hard to hire school bus drivers between the requirements of being able to drive a bus, being good with kids, passing a background check, etc. Like that's a tough job that probably doesn't pay amazingly.
Probably did. I only ever had the one bus driver. His name was Russ. Everyone.
Mine's name was Susan. Shout out to Susan.
Everyone,
Shout out to Russ.
Everyone loved Russ because he would. There was one specific speed bump that he knew wasn't dangerous, and he would take us over the speed bump at full speed so we could all jump in the back of the bus, and it was great fun.
Children loved are missing. We absolutely did that too, and. So children are missing out on this great opportunity to like have a little bit more joy in their days if they're
just
not
a little bit more. Yeah, just a little bit.
Oh my God. Incredible. So, okay. So we need transit.
Yes. I think to finish out the transit point, a lot of people also have the same concern about transit that they have about apartments. And I want to sort of assuage that concern here a little bit. Lots of people think that transit is dangerous and that like you shouldn't be sending your kids to be on transit, right? But there is like just quite frankly basically no evidence of this whatsoever. It might be the case that people have like on average more unpleasant experiences on transit, perhaps. Sort of what you define as unpleasant, right? Like do you define like experiencing someone like barreling past you in sort of a road rage incident as like an unpleasant experience as a driver? Like do you connect that in the same way to driving that you connect like a person who smells bad on the bus to being like a bad experience you've had with transit? Sort of neither here nor there, right?
I think it's a great point though. I think it's a great point.
But the basic fact of like actual safety and injury is that private vehicles are like an order of magnitude more dangerous than transit is. I'm getting these specific figures from NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. I think that's what all of that stands for. Private cars are, the death rate in cars is 18 times higher than it is in trains, and 135 times higher than it is on the bus. So an order of magnitude off from trains and 2 orders of magnitude actually off from the bus. Transit is, at least in terms of how likely you are to end up dead, way, way safer than driving in a private vehicle.
And I think many of us, just in terms of a gut check on that, I cannot think of a single bus accident in my entire K through 12 life that anybody had. I can think of at least 2 extremely dramatic traffic crashes just in high school involving peers or friends.
Yeah. Like the traffic, like the danger of driving and like especially like sort of driving under the influence and everything is so like pervasive that in California high schools, or at least in my high school, they did every single year I think it's called Every 15 Minutes, where they stage a bad traffic accident on the road outside of the high school and like have students walk around like in like a death mask basically like for a full day of school.
They used to do this every 4 years at my high school because they wanted all of us to be surprised.
I see. Actually, it might not have been every year at my high school. It might have been every 2 years or something like that. Yeah. But I remember it happening. It definitely happened at least twice while I was in high school. Yeah. And there are
like, it's very memorable.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Like it's a like absolutely affecting experience, right? And yeah, like it just is the case that driving is more dangerous. Like I don't know what else to say at this point about
especially
it. Right?
we all know, especially in the case of high schools, we know that teenagers are dangerous drivers. That's why their insurance rates are higher, and that's why we have restrictions on where they can go and what they can do when they get their license.
Yeah, and who they can have in the car with them when they get their license.
So we are simultaneously saying that we want to limit the driving of these children, but we also will create no other way for them to get to school.
Yeah, and I think this is a really good parlay into the 4th point here, Megan. Great, really. Thank you. After making it legal to do these things, after stopping these dumb rules, after building denser forms of housing, after improving transit, then we actually need to build schools back in sort of more urban environments. We can't do all of these things and then keep building schools out in the boonies where everyone still needs to drive. It just won't work, right? Beyond just embracing the school bus, sort of the putative theme of this episode, we need to really like embrace the urban form. And at this point, we're going to take it maybe a little bit broader. And I'm just going to sort of say, I know that there are going to be a lot of people who say they don't want to live in a city, right? They want to live in a suburb. They want to live in a rural area. They don't like cities. And to those people, I would say, just don't live in a city. Don't live in one. No one is making you. No one is forcing you. Like, fuck off. Go live somewhere in the suburbs, right? Like, do that. Right? Like, there are problems with the suburbs. We'll get into them in a future episode. But like, no one is forcing you to live in an apartment. Like,
no, just the idea that we will create apartments for people who would like to live in them, and we will create schools near those apartments doesn't threaten anybody's ability to live in a suburb and to drive to school. It actually will probably make that easier because building more housing brings down prices.
And as we've talked about before, getting people into transit makes for a better driving experience for you. Like, as a driver, if there are fewer cars on the road, your driving experience sucks less. It sucks less to sit in.
Proved very recently by New York City, right?
Yes, exactly. In order to avoid me crashing out a little bit here, let's move on to
bringing you in.
Yes,
we're going to anchor you to something a little more tangible.
Okay. So I think a great example of how this will actually help to solve problems comes from New York City's congestion pricing implementation. Like, obviously, everything we've talked about so far, like, it helps solve sort of the proximate problem that we've been talking about, like, of entrenching sprawl into our educational environment to help fill the need for schools in growing places. And like, how right now, like, cities just simply cannot do this. If we do the above things, which I'm not totally sure we will do. In fact, I think we probably won't, because again, feeling sort of pessimistic today, sort of with the general state of the world. But it also helps solve broader problems. It doesn't just solve those proximate problems of education. It helps solve all manner of other problems. And particularly, it helps solve these traffic problems, right?
To bring us back to the point, didn't you say something like 15%?
Yes, 10 to 15% of rush hour traffic, essentially, is people driving their children to school. That is the figure from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics as of 2024. And we can take lessons from New York City's congestion pricing as to how significant taking all or even some of those cars off of the road would be. So to give you some figures here from the MTA in New York, the first month of congestion pricing has seen a 7.5% decrease in just like the number of vehicles entering the congestion zone. So just like the total number of them that enter on any given day, which is analogous to, say, about half of the current private vehicles arriving at schools being replaced by other types of trips that don't require people being in a car. So just half of those people like changing their minds, doing something else. But journey times have decreased way, way more than just 7.5%. According to the MTA, they are down 22.25% on average across routes in the congestion zone, and down routes into the congestion zone. Sorry, not routes in the congestion zone, routes into the congestion zone, and then 14.5% on routes within the zone. So we have a 7.5% decrease in vehicles that has led to a much larger decrease in travel times. Even small decreases in traffic volumes can decrease traffic times really, really significantly. And this makes sense, right? Like, you figure you have a road that is basically operating at capacity, and when it exceeds its capacity is when you get really bad traffic jams. And so if you can bring that road down to just under its capacity for being utilized through better transit, through congestion pricing, through getting people out of their cars and into quite literally any other form of transportation, then you can decrease travel times very, very significantly, because the road is able to handle that traffic volume, because that is what it is designed for. That is what it is designed for.
Makes sense. It makes sense to me.
Yeah, and like, again, as we talked about earlier in this episode, and as we talked about in the transportation episode, at a certain point, this is just a question of geometry. cars take up more space per person than any other form of transportation. And so decreasing the number of people who arrive to school in private vehicles decreases the amount of space that they take up when they are arriving to school. And that is sort of the crux of the issue here. Everything we've been talking about here is about taking up less space, because in places that are in high demand, that have high housing prices, that are struggling to make sure that everyone can get to school in an efficient way, the problem is that we are taking up too much space at almost every single step of the process. And so we need to stop doing that.
Or at least make it possible to stop doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Make it even if we don't end up doing every single one of these things, if we don't totally solve the problem, the very first step in the process needs to be making it possible to solve the problem in the first place. And that, I think, is what we've been failing to do thus far. I think that was probably as good a place as any to call it.
It's a multifaceted problem, but it will, if we can figure out how to fix it, it's going to help make a lot of different areas of people's lives a little bit better.
Yeah. And I'm struggling to end the episode here, perhaps because, again, not feeling particularly optimistic today.
You know what? But you gotta, keep on trucking, man. This is it's the little cat poster. Hang in there.
Oh, geez, not the hang in there poster, Megan.
I'm trying.
Honestly, the hang in there poster is extremely millennial coded.
Really?
I think it's really millennial coded.
Dang it. Okay. Well, now that Clayton has succeeded in bringing me down, let's wrap this up.
Well, yeah, until I become more optimistic and until there's actually any sort of movement on any of these policy priorities, I have been Clayton Becker.
I have been Megan Cox.
And hopefully the next time we talk to you, we'll feel a little bit better about ourselves.
Yeah, fingers crossed. But thank you very much for sticking with us, and we will see you again on the next one.